My name is Michael Gould. I'm Vice Chair of the Haldane Society of Socialist Lawyers. I'm a criminal barrister at Haldane Court Chambers. Haldane Society of Socialist Lawyers. This is hosting the lecture today. This is one of our lectures in this series of human rights law-based lectures that we do throughout the academic year. Thank you to College of Law for hosting this one. We tend to sort of alternate between University of Law. Sorry, I was here a few years ago when it was still the College of Law. Didn't mean to any disrespect. We usually alternate between here and the BPP as well. What does the Haldane Society do? I can sort of say it does what it says in the tin, really. The Haldane Society of Socialist Lawyers. We're a group of mainly lawyers, but not just lawyers, really anyone that has an interest in law or some kind of perhaps practice in law. So we include practicing lawyers, law students, legal academics, or anyone that comes into kind of contact with legal issues or an interest in legal issues in their work, like journalists, trade unionists. We are a socialist organisation. That's something we're proud of, and we've committed to that. We approach our work and our analysis of the law from a socialist perspective. If you are interested in finding out more about the Haldane Society or joining us, which I would certainly encourage you to do, and then check out our website, haldane.org. I think most of you are students. The membership subscription, I think, is only £20 a year, so it should be manageable, hopefully, for most student budgets. I think you can split that out into monthly payments as well. Today's talk is where next for the ICC, the International Criminal Court. We've got two excellent speakers. I'm very glad to be able to introduce to you who'll be speaking tonight. First, and I believe we came from Wayne Jordash, he's a barrister at Doughty Street Chambers and Director of Global Rights Compliance. He has more than 20 years experience in international human rights law and humanitarian law. He's appeared in most international tribunals, including the International Court of Justice and the ICC. Our second speaker then will be Carla Ferstman. She's the director of Redress, a human rights organisation that helps victims of torture to obtain justice and reparation and to access the International Criminal Court. She's both a lawyer and an academic and a noted commentator on the ICC and victims' rights. Wayne and Carla will each speak probably for 20 to 30 minutes, although I'm not going to do any guillotine rulings. And after that, there will be an opportunity for questions from the floor, and then that'll probably take us to 8:30 when we'll be wrapping up. So I won't say anything further in that case. Move over to the speakers.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation to speak for the Haldane Society. So I've been asked to look at the subject of what next for the ICC. So to start that conversation, let's look at what's happened so far. Let's face it, if the ICC was a private business, it would have gone out of business. If you look at how much money has been spent, $1 billion and more, 153 million last year, and in terms of convictions, sentences, not that much to show for it, a handful of convictions and sentences to date. So any assessment of what's happened so far, especially under the first prosecutor's watch, has to consider the proposition that the ICC is not functioning very well. In relation to the 18 cases opened under the first ICC prosecutor, 4 of those cases were rejected at the confirmation stage. 7 arrest warrants were issued and not effected, leaving the likes of Sudan's al-Bashir, Kony in Uganda, Gaddafi and al-Sanusi in Libya, arguably thumbing their noses at the court. And it wasn't just the lack of trials and processes, but it was the quality of the processes in those early years under Ocampo. Kenya, which was the result of investigations which took place under his watch, probably the best known example of this. 1,200 people killed, thousands of victims of gender-based violence, 600,000 people displaced, and at the ICC, no convictions. Well-founded allegations of witness tampering, exaggerated evidence, and prosecution incompetence. Charges not confirmed or dismissed due to lack of evidence, and in the words of Senior Counsel at Human Rights Watch, victims bereft of justice and help that they needed. As the new prosecutor, Fatou Bensouda, declared a dark day for international criminal justice, and who could possibly disagree? So despite Ocampo's promise of a sexy court dispensing swift and comprehensive justice, and claims to be prosecuting on behalf of humanity and working to end impunity, the ICC appears very distant from those aspirations. In the words of the Congolese foreign minister who headed a joint African Union mission in Darfur, observing Ocampo's approach, quote, "He gives the impression of someone who may cut corners on legal preparation, fails to think strategies through to their logical conclusion, and is influenced by the media rather than evidence-driven." And of course, given the immense potential authority of the ICC prosecutor, these types of approaches led to impacts way beyond The Hague. As Adada also noted, the prosecutor's case against al-Bashir, the president of Sudan, had polarized Sudanese politics and weakened those who occupied the middle ground of compromise and consensus, the type of compromise and consensus which was necessary to end the conflict. Quite an achievement for an international, for the world's prosecutor to target someone like al-Bashir and end up not only not getting your man, but alienating the very people necessary to ensure humanitarian protection and bring an end to the conflict. And so it goes on. Not only bad management and ineffective investigation, but the pursuit of African cases, and cases where only one side of the conflict were pursued, leading to well-founded but albeit overstated claims of politicization and instrumentalization. It takes a special kind of skill to turn a continent that once contained some of the most enthusiastic adherents to the Rome Statutes into a position where they are constantly these days threatening a mass war cache. Of course, there are good reasons beyond the prosecutor's approach why African states are threatening to walk out, and there's very good reasons why they figured disproportionately in the early cases of the ICC. Not least of which is that some of those countries referred themselves to the ICC. However, the approach taken by the first prosecutor gave the AU an excuse to claim that the court was discriminatory and point out the lack of investigations into other states such as Afghanistan and Iraq and other places where Western powers were implicated. So after Ocampo's problematic reign, Fatou Bensouda was elected prosecutor in 2012, along with her extremely competent deputy, James Stewart. And they've set to try to improve the efficiency and the standing of the ICC, especially the prosecution division. There are now 10 situations under investigation and 11 under preliminary examination. And these, when one looks at them, reflect a more even-handed selection and prioritization of cases. Cases such as Afghanistan, Burundi, Colombia, Georgia, Guinea, Iraq, Nigeria, Ukraine, and the state of Palestine. Notwithstanding this improvement, and to be very fair to those new prosecutors, they have a lot to do. Notwithstanding this improvement, the statistics still do not look terribly impressive. 15 years, $1.3 billion, still only 42 indictees in 23 cases, out of which 9 are in the pre-trial phase, and at least 12 arrest warrants outstanding, and only a handful of ongoing trials. One might think not a great basis for any optimism. However, I feel quite optimistic about the ICC, despite what I've just said. And the principal reason for that is that I never expected it to do more than a handful of trials, and I never expected those trials to be anything other than politicised, slow, cumbersome, tending towards unfairness, the type of unfairness you wouldn't see, for example, in the UK courts, and ultimately ineffective vehicles for more than a symbolic showing of accountability that might, with luck, engender national trials and implementation of IHL at the state level. Now, if you take seriously the claims of the ICC that it will, quote, put an end to impunity for the perpetrators of the most serious crimes of concern to the international community, or if you allow yourself to luxuriate in Kofi Annan's rhetoric that the ICC was a gift of hope to future generations and a giant step forward in the march towards universal human rights and the rule of law, then it's difficult not to be disappointed. If you believe the hype that the ICC will put an end to impunity, end wars, give voice to the voiceless, heal nations and reconcile warring parties, the present ICC docket looks like an abject failure and is evidence of a failing institution with no meaningful future ahead of it. But we've been here before, and for those of us who've worked in the courts over the last 15 years, this is no surprise at all. The ICC is not the first international criminal tribunal that has suffered disappointment. They've all suffered from a fate of expectation, undue politicisation, and a lack of competence and trial know-how. Other than the fact that the ICC is subject to a level of public scrutiny which has not been experienced by the other institutions, in my view there's nothing surprising or unusual about the last 10 or 15 years of the ICC. If you look carefully at the ICTR, the Rwandan Tribunal, Special Court for Sierra Leone, the ECCC, the Lebanese Tribunal, and the ICTY, in many respects what happened at the ICC over the last 15 years is mirrored and comparable to what's happened in those courts. Those courts too also were subject to a huge wave of optimism at the outset of their work. The UN Security Council resolution establishing the ICTY stated that one of the aims of the tribunal was the restoration and maintenance of peace. Similarly, the ICTR UN Security Resolution noted that the prosecution of persons for crimes in that institution would contribute to the process of national reconciliation and to the restoration and maintenance of peace. Now, in this short address, is not the time to address and analyse those claims, but I am absolutely certain that the same people who were making those claims at the outset of the ICTR and the ICTY would be somewhat more circumspect now, looking at what has happened with those courts. They have achieved a lot, there's no doubt about it, but despite their achievements, legitimate criticisms abound concerning unwelcome and poorly explained judgments, a failure to account for their work, a failure of communication of their work, and a failure of legacy. So these are the common criticisms of all the modern day criminal institutions. And if one listens to civil society in these affected communities, one can see clearly that these institutions have not lived up to their own self-imposed hype. Critics like the Ebuka, an umbrella group for genocide survivors in Rwanda, say, quote, the ICTR has delivered nothing for either the victims or the survivors of the genocide, delivering no compensation for the horrific atrocities committed during the genocide and perpetrated by the government. Tim Gallin-Moore, the spokesman for the ICTR, prosecutor between 2004 and 2008, stated, quote, I don't think there's any jurisdiction anywhere in the world that if you did a comparable assessment of the price and the number of people involved, that would say the investment was a good return. It needed to be done and still needs to be done, but I'm disappointed about the justice aspect of it. One can perfectly understand the criticism if you consider that the ICTR only indicted 93 people at a cost of around $2 billion. Now, there are those who will argue that the principal difficulties encountered which give rise to these criticisms in international criminal law prosecutions relate to the investigation in the field and the difficulties in gathering evidence in conflict or post-conflict environments. The fact that witnesses are often located far from the seat of the court, the large scale and traumatic impact of the crimes, the challenges of linking senior leaders to crimes on the ground, the need to establish contextual elements of the crimes, and the problem of protection of witnesses, and so on, present real problems. And this is one of the arguments which I use to explain the ICC's poor record and also the difficulties in the other institutions. And it's fair to note that at the ICC, looking at the future and what it holds, that these challenges are perhaps even greater for that institution. It, unlike its predecessor institutions, has to wrestle with a wider range of conflicts, a wider range of histories, and a wider range of cultures. It has no Chapter 7 mandate, unlike the ICTR and the ICTY. So even though the Rome Statute is supposed to create obligations of cooperation, it doesn't in reality have the same teeth to apprehend suspects and ensure the effective investigations and prosecutions. The ICC cannot sanction states directly for non-cooperation. It must refer non-compliance to the Security Council or the Assembly of State Parties, and who can be surprised when such mechanism fails to prove effective when 3 of the Security Council members, the US, China, and Russia, are not even members of the ICC. So, although it feels somewhat cathartic to criticize the ICC as somehow a failing institution, there is nothing in the list of criticisms that I've given that is surprising or new. We've been here before. The details are different. Each international criminal law project suffers its own specific problems and its own specific criticism. But in my view, it's time to accept the reality that these courts are plagued by inefficiency and ineffectiveness, and do not, in the end, bring the kind of transitional justice benefits promised by those well-intentioned founders of these institutions. The reality is that it was inevitable that the ICC would spend its first years failing to deliver, failing to conduct trials in an expeditious manner, and otherwise disappointing those who held such great hopes for the institution. The prosecution of these types of crimes are extremely difficult, using the existing state and international system. They rarely occur without politics creeping into the adjudicative process, and there's something inherently difficult about the investigative and prosecution processes. But that is not to argue this level of ineffectiveness is inevitable. But it is to say, well, this is where we are. What's happened in the last 25 years is that international criminal law has developed processes and designs which are ineffective. The procedural design of the institutions are now a feature of the legal landscape that cannot easily be avoided or somehow chipped away at to produce effective and efficient and fair trials. In my view, therefore, one doesn't need a crystal ball to work out what happens next with the ICC. The reality is that these concerns, these structural and design problems of international criminal law trial will continue to bedevil the international justice project. There was never any meaningful indication that the ICC would be any different, or that it would escape these problems, or in my view, that the next 15 years will be significantly different. Things will improve, no doubt, but significantly different, not in my view. So we need to be realistic and embed our forecasts about the ICC in the history of these modern-day tribunals. And the predictable inability of ICC trials to meet these wider transitional justice expectations, and the predictable inability of ICC trials to be quick and, in the words of Ocampo, sexy justice. In this respect, therefore, the forecasting of the next 15 years is quite straightforward. In my view, we can look at three very simple things which will tell us what the ICC can and cannot do in the next 15 years. These will sound very matter-of-fact and very prosaic, but I think it's time, given the history of the ICC, to take that approach. These are three considerations, I say, will predict what happens at the ICC in the next 15 years. One, the number of courtrooms. Two, the unwieldy and cumbersome nature of the ICC processes. And three, the amount of resources that member states are willing to invest in the institution. In my view, these factors, as prosaic as they sound, will define what the ICC prosecutor is able to do and what the ICC is able to do over the next 15 years. In short, they will be able to conduct a handful of symbolic, expressive cases that will be, with luck, designed as deterrents and engines for change at the state level. Until there is a root and branch shake-up of the international criminal law as a whole and international criminal court processes, and this is not likely to happen anytime soon, this is the future of the ICC. The ICC will be constrained to act as a symbolic court whose main work will, with luck, be encouraging, enhancing, and galvanizing the real accountability work at the state level. This is, in my view, realistic and actually may turn out to be rather a good thing. So, one, the number of courtrooms. The reality is the court has 3 courtrooms and 18 judges. Therefore, it cannot conduct more than 6 trials at any one time. Currently, there are 5 cases in the trial phase. So when we ask ourselves, why isn't the ICC doing more? Well, it's almost full up now, and what it's doing is not very impressive. Now, why the Assembly of State Parties decided to build a gleaming new building costing millions of dollars and only stock it with 3 courts is a mystery. But it is a problem that has plagued international justice from the beginning. It sounds very simple and very obvious and very silly, but it's a feature of all the institutions. Go to the ICTY, go to the ICTR when it existed, huge buildings, huge administration, and 2, 3, 4 courts, and that is it. So whatever the prosecution does, whatever the success of the preliminary examinations, whatever the success of the investigations, however many people she wants to indict, she can only indict according to the ability of the court to actually conduct 6 trials at any one time. Second, the design of the ICC processes. The Rome Statute and the Rules of Procedure and Evidence define the trial process and the manner in which the judiciary will be able to implement the procedures. I can't do justice to this subject in the time permitted, but frankly, if anybody was to sit down and really seriously think and had the free hand to design the ICC trial processes afresh, they would almost certainly not design the one that is governed by the ICC Rome Statute and the Rules of Procedure and Evidence. It is inevitable on the basis of that framework that ICC trials from preliminary examination to full investigations to trial and appeal judgments will be measured in years, not weeks, and not months. It takes years to conduct a preliminary examination. It takes just as long to conduct full investigations. And when that is done, there is a confirmation process if the process goes that far. And a confirmation process may well turn out to be a mini trial. Again, that is a process which will take a long time, and there's very little that can be done about that with a given design. There are things which can be done. You can increase the speed of investigations, you can better manage the evidence, you can stop delegating investigative functions to intermediaries in countries where the ICC is functioning. You can refine the confirmation process, and you can have more focused trials, you can have more consistent application of the law, you can have more streamlined processes for victims and witnesses. But the reality is, even if that is done, this will shave a few months off each process, nothing more than that. So we are stuck with the ICC with trial processes which will last years. The Lubanga case took from the beginning to the end of the trial and appeal phase 9 years. The Chui case took 8 years, and the Bemba case started in 2009 with confirmation in 2009 and is only just at the appeal stage. Shaving a few months off these processes that last 8 or 9 years is a laudable aim, but unlikely to change the future of the ICC. Finally, resources generally. There is a view expressed by Matt Brown in the blog Opinio Juris that, quote, the financial strangulation of the court is, if anything, a far greater threat to the court's ability to fulfill its mandate than the withdrawal of 3 states, referring to the 3 African states which were threatening to withdraw recently. I couldn't agree more with this view. Even though the budget has seen an increase in the last few years, the Assembly of State Parties continuously seeks to limit the budget. Moreover, 1 member state out of 5 is not paying its dues in full, including Canada, Italy and Germany. Behind the scenes, anger over the court's inability to prosecute those responsible for some of the world's most shocking crimes has been coupled with relentless criticism of the rising budget and the disproportionate amount allocated to the prosecution. So the budget is unlikely to increase much very soon. So to summarise, these 3 issues, rooms, processes and resources, are structural and systemic. There are not enough courts, not enough resources, not enough speed. And these will not go away in the near future. New courtrooms will not materialise, processes will not become substantially more efficient or abbreviated without major reform, and resources for this beleaguered institution are not going to descend from the heavens to meet any of the difficulties. And so the ICC is boxed in. It is restrained by frailties in the processes and the resources. Just look at the ICTY for a moment. The most successful, probably, of the institutions, of the international criminal institutions, the most effective and the most efficient. Over the last 24 years, it has dealt with 161 indictments, which is an average of 8.5 per year, 83 convictions, and a combined bill of $2.3 billion. This is the kind of performance the ICC can only aspire to at this moment. And in the next 15 years, if it achieves anything like that, it will be an improvement and welcome. There is no reason at the moment to suppose that the ICC will do better than what the ICTY did. So, to summarise, symbolic trials are inevitable in my view. As I said, even though things have improved under a new and much more effective prosecution team, they are first of all engaged in clearing up the Ocampo mess. And they have some very difficult choices to make, given the paucity of courtrooms and resources. Inevitably, in my view, she'll have to be selective, and inevitably, she'll have to be symbolic in those choices. Of course, this may encourage her to be innovative in her choices and in the way in which she interprets her mandate. Indeed, recently she's indicated a willingness to be more creative in types of cases she focuses upon. In the OTP's policy paper on case selection of 2016, she indicated, quote, that she would be interested in cooperating and providing assistance to states with respect to conduct which constitutes a serious crime under national law, such as the illegal exploitation of natural resources, arms trafficking, human trafficking, terrorism, financial crimes, land grabbing, or the destruction of the environment. In sum, she is looking to expand her focus from the classical type of crimes prosecuted so far to include a wider remit of mass atrocity crimes. Arguably, with the recent Al-Mahidi case, the first conviction with regards to crimes against cultural artifacts, this was an example of that approach in action. However, it was only in 2012 and 2015 that the Office of the Prosecutor made it a key strategic goal to integrate a gender perspective into the ICC's work. As this and the dearth of trials at the ICC indicates, there is much to be done prosecuting core and classical crimes, if I can put it that way, and ensuring that such things as gender-based crimes that have remained shockingly under-prosecuted at the tribunals are pursued and effectively conducted. We should also recall, when considering and feeling excited about the possibility that the ICC prosecutor will look wider in her prosecutions, that in relation to the preliminary examinations currently being conducted, almost, in fact, all of them are focused on classical war crimes and crimes against humanity. So, assuming for the moment that they lead to full investigations, the present case docket for the prosecutor is focused on the same type of core crimes. There are some indications that she is likely to open a full investigation into land grabbing in Cambodia, which deals with crimes against humanity outside the confines of an armed conflict, which would be quite an innovative step. But in my view, this type of innovation, given these restraints, are likely to be few and far between in the very near future. So, the future of the ICC is not in The Hague, the future of the ICC is at the national level. One of the most lauded principles of the ICC and international criminal justice in general is the notion of nurturing and enabling domestic legal systems to adequately prosecute and to try individuals suspected of committing international crimes. So the ICC was always envisaged, as you will appreciate, as a court of last resort, existing to plug the impunity gap. The gap exists where states and their legal systems are unable or unwilling to prosecute perpetrators of international crimes. And a central theme of the ICC's work is supposed to be to foster positive complementarity. Indeed, as far back as 2009, this was stated in the prosecutorial strategy, the idea that the prosecutor would work to bolster the ability of the state to do the prosecutions themselves. As the OTP noted at that point, encouraging domestic proceedings did not involve direct financial, technical or capacity building assistance, but rather it relied on various networks of cooperation. This included involving national judiciaries, officials, experts, lawyers, other UN bodies, non-governmental organisations and so on, in sharing information and activities designed to promote accountability and the end of impunity. Now, this notion was originally envisaged at a time when the ICC still believed it could, even as a court of last resort, conduct a reasonable amount of trials. If the ICC accepts, and I hope it does, that this is not likely to happen in the near future, it may be willing to adopt a broader view of positive complementarity, one that actually steps into the role of providing direct financial, technical or capacity building assistance to states that show a willingness to implement IHL obligations to provide effective penal sanctions at the domestic levels. The impact of these symbolic prosecutions at the ICC, combined with this kind of approach to positive complementarity, is currently unknown and very difficult to determine. However, there is a growing body of information that suggests that even the ICC symbolic prosecutions, its presence in various countries, conducting ICC processes and investigations, and the threat it conveys of dragging authorities to The Hague is an effective deterrent and encouragement for change and domestic accountability. So, it is to be hoped that a heavy dose of reality descends soonest on the ICC. It may not be capable of conducting more than a handful of cases in the next few years, but with creativity and care it can select and prioritise the right cases and focus its work on ensuring it assists, supports, cajoles and coerces efforts at the domestic level to ensure its aims and objectives. Despite the indications in The Hague concerning the lack of trials in The Hague, this positive complementarity work, married with symbolic cases, in my view, suggests the ICC may have rather a healthy future ahead of it. Thank you.